Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bike Fans Breakdown of the 2018 NFL Draft. I'm Tom Moore from BikeFans.com, and joining me inside the NFL Personnel Department is our resident scouting insider, Jeff Nichols. And I got to say, Jeff, for a guy like you who likes to break down talent and project how these college players are going to fit in the NFL, this has got to be darned exciting the next 7 to 10 days for you.
You know what, Tom? It always is. I mean, the draft is almost like a mini holiday for me. I mean, the time leading up to it's a lot of fun with all the news breaking, all the interest and prospects from different teams, and, the ability to do some self-scouting here.
It's a phenomenon. Isn't it amazing? Effectively, if you break it down, you and I are going to watch people get job offers. It's amazing. And it'll get better ratings in the World Series.
I know. It's a drama in action. It's reality TV, but someone's life's actually on the line.
It really is. It probably was our first reality TV show besides the news.
So people forget that.
They do. Well, let's jump right in and get your thoughts, really, both on the Viking draft that's coming up, and I also want to, in the process, ask you about some of the areas of the team that's changed, really, since the last time we spoke from Lincoln Financial Field. You ready to go?
I am, whenever you're ready.
All right, the big one that really saw improvement last year, especially because of a mobile quarterback there, is the offensive line. And with Joe Berger retiring here a couple of weeks ago, this, I would think, has to be a target area for the Vikings in the first couple of rounds. And I'm going to have a couple questions here, but I'm going to start with whether you think the offensive line is the best bet to be a first-round target for the Vikings, and if so, who best fits that scheme for this Viking offense?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the question that's really on everyone's mind. The Vikings took a step in the right direction along their O-line this past season. But, Joe Berger's retirement, and, it still wasn't great. And, I mean, I think there's still another level or that upper echelon that the offensive line can get to. It really depends what they want to do with Mike Remmers. Do they want to bounce him inside and play him at guard like they experimented with at the end of last season? Or do they want to keep him outside at offensive tackle? I mean, I don't think the Vikings necessarily will know that answer until they get through the draft, because I don't think they're going to pigeonhole themselves into the corner and say, we need to take an offensive tackle because we're going to move Remmers inside, or we're going to have to take a guard because we need to bounce or keep Remmers on the outside. I think it really is going to come down to the best player available. As we approach that 30th pick, there's going to be a run of some sort on interior offensive linemen. Where that begins really is the biggest question. It could start as early as the late teens when you have Seattle and Dallas picking, and it could start later on, more in the early 20s when you get into the range of maybe the Cincinnati Bengals, who also need to improve their O-line. If that run starts earlier, the Vikings probably will have a decision to make. Do they want to trade up a few spots to get a guy that they're interested in? Or do they want to kind of stay put and let the draft fall to them? They have the luxury with a talented roster to wait on offensive line if they really need to. The interior O-line depth in this draft class really lasts through the third round. I mean, the ongoing name throughout the Viking community has been Isaiah Wynn, the offensive tackle out of Georgia, who projects as an interior offensive lineman. He brings a lot to the table, especially for the Vikings' zone blocking scheme. He's a very athletic guy who can move, and he really looks for work, which is a trait the Vikings have looked for in their offensive linemen in the past 2 years or so. The other name that I think could be of interest is Connor Williams, the offensive tackle out of Texas. In 2016, he looked like he'd be gone before the top 15 picks, albeit people didn't consider his actual measurables until this year. He projects better to be probably an interior lineman at the NFL level just due to a lack of weight and length. He's a technician in his craft, and he's very athletic. And I think the Vikings could see him as kind of a versatile piece that they could both try at right tackle at the beginning of the season, if it's something that they thought would be better to bump Remmers inside, or they could just bounce him to the inside right away because he's ideally a day one starter at either left or right guard.
You talk about Remmers, that's a question as you look at game film. What do you think is his more natural and better position? Is it inside a guard, or is that a tackle where he started?
You know what? It's hard to say what's more natural to him just because he's played offensive tackle basically his entire tenure in the NFL. But I think if you look at him as the player, he does an all right job with the power rushers, and he does a good job once he's able to get out in space as a run blocker. But he really struggles at times, and the consistency isn't there against the speed rush. And as the NFL has become a more pass-driven league, you're seeing both defensive ends really bring a lot of speed and multiple pass rushing threats to the table. And I think that makes it just as hard on the right tackle as a left tackle at times. And maybe the Vikings believe that if they bounce Remmers inside, they're going to be using him more as a run mauler, and they're not going to have to worry about that threat of someone getting the best of him using their speed.
The other guy was drafted last year. A lot of people had a lot of high expectation of Danny Isadora. Your thoughts on seeing him play a little bit? What's his progress like? Is he the future at guard, or is he more of a utility lineman?
I think at this point he'll have the chance to compete for a guard spot in camp, but he definitely looks more like a utility lineman. And I mean, that's not to say that he can't become or develop into a starting guard. But when he got on the field last year, he showed some good things, especially in the run game, but sometimes in pass protection. There were some lapses at times. Of course, you can't expect the world of a rookie. It takes time for them to develop into their craft and, understand their role within an offense. So maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised this offseason with the work Isadora has put in. But I think for the time being, you can't really depend on him as a starter either.
I got to turn my attention because you and I need to make best friends with Eric Kendricks because he just signed a lucrative contract extension. But it also kind of brings up a question about that linebacker position. With Kendricks, who was drafted after Anthony Barr signing, what does that mean potentially for Anthony Barr? Is it a concern of whether he'll be back that he's not signed yet, or how do you see that? And either way, do you see the Vikings going early, maybe in the first 2 or 3 rounds for a linebacker?
So I think there's a couple questions in there, and there's a couple different ways to look at it. I mean, I think the Vikings did the right thing by extending Kendricks. He's been a leader in the locker room, and he's honestly done everything they've asked of him as an inside linebacker. He can play in coverage. He has mastered the double A gap blitz package, and he really is just a versatile piece on that defense. So, I mean, his extension should come as no surprise to the rest of the Vikings on the roster. When it comes to Anthony Barr, the Vikings like Anthony Barr, and he definitely had a bit of a comeback season this past year. I mean, I know that Zimmer and the defensive coaching staff weren't thrilled with him after 2016. And in 2017, although he didn't have many eye-popping plays, some people would disagree after the Aaron Rodgers hit, but that was the only eye-popping play he needed. But
that's a shoulder-popping play.
Yeah, that's a shoulder-popping play. But I think the Vikings ideally want to keep Barr on this roster. I do think that Kendrick's contract that he got does set some limitations on what the Vikings would be willing to pay, though. I mean, I think that Anthony's Barr camp could come in and say that, well, if you threw him in a 34 defensive system, he's going to be a pass rushing threat, and his sack numbers would be much higher than they would be in the Vikings defense. But then on the Vikings side, they can say, well, you're not, and you haven't proven that, and you're just, that's just an assumption on your part. So I would imagine the Vikings want to get Barr locked up in some contract in the range of what Kendricks just got. I mean, ultimately, I'm guessing it eventually gets done. But I do think the Vikings will be interested in an offense or in an outside linebacker in the draft as well, but not your typical outside linebacker. I think they might try to kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone and find an offensive linebacker who can also put their hand in the dirt as a pass rusher, because then they're going to be able to add another pass rushing threat along the D-line, maybe add more of a Swiss Army knife that they can play in the nickel package, while also kind of filling the gap left when Emmanuel Lemur left the team this past offseason.
With the exception of Kendricks and Barr, typically the Vikings go late. They go 5th, 6th round. We got a whole bunch of 6th-rounders this year. Is that more logically where you would expect them to try to pick up a linebacker?
Honestly, it depends how the board falls. They've done some work on some of the more mid-round offense or outside linebackers. In the first round, I mean, I think Lorenzo Carter would be an amazing piece to add to the defense, but is the value really there? Probably not. But once you get into the 2nd and 3rd rounds, Uchenna Nwosu, the outside linebacker out of USC, who can also put his hands in the dirt, would probably be a nice fit for the Vikings defense as a rotational pass rusher and someone who could maybe evolve into a weak side linebacker. Otherwise, kind of a name that's kind of fallen under the radar due to his injuries is Kimiko Toure out of Rutgers. Initially, when he kind of blew the world on fire when he started playing at Rutgers, and everyone was so impressed with the kid who kind of took on football late in his life. The injuries really derailed his career at Rutgers the last few years, but teams really see the potential there for a pass rushing threat. If they start looking at late round linebackers, Oren Burks out of Vanderbilt is someone the Vikings probably would be interested in. He has all the speed, size, and he actually used to play safety in that Vanderbilt defense as a freshman. And now that he's an outside linebacker, he's kind of that Swiss Army knife that the Vikings like, that can play any of the linebacker spots while also maybe adding some unique ability on special teams as well.
If you jump from the defense to the offense, you always go to the sexy position. It's quarterback, running back. Let's do running back. Everybody's getting paid but you and me, Jeff. I mean, Jerick McKinnon got a big contract, and that leaves the opening for Dalvin Cook to come back. A couple things here. I'm curious, do you expect him to be at full speed after that ACL surgery by the time the season opens up? And then second of all, would you expect the Vikings to look for a backfill for Jerick McKinnon, kind of a change of pace back in this draft?
So I think the blessing in disguise in Cook's injury is that it happened early enough in the season that he almost has an entire year to recover before he actually gets on the playing field this fall. So, I mean, the hope definitely has to be that he's going to be able to come back and be the special player we saw on film early this past Vikings season. And, I mean, I think the Vikings renegotiating Latavius Murray's contract as well is them hedging against the chance that he can't carry the load right away in the season. Because Murray did a very good job and probably exceeded some people's expectations this past year as well. And hopefully takes the burden off of Cooks when it comes to goal line and short yardage situations. But if there's one thing we know from new offensive coordinator John DeFilippo in Philadelphia is he likes to have three different kinds of running backs. Cook is probably their more versatile piece. He can both be a pass catcher and can run the ball between the tackles and outside. You got the bruiser in Murray. But I think having more of a pass-catching specialist is something they'll be very interested in this draft class.
Anybody stick out in your mind who fills that role kind of in the middle rounds? I know we don't have a fourth, but we got thirds and fifths and things like that. Anybody stick out for you?
I'd imagine Spielman's going to try his best to pick up a fourth-round pick somehow, whether that's trading back in the first or even in the second, just to give them that mid-round pick. But a player they've done some work on is Nyheim Hines, the track star out of North Carolina State. And I mean, I think he's a good fit for two reasons. One, I think he can be a good pass-catching piece for Kirk Cousins, and he just makes things happen with the ball in his hands. But when you look at the Vikings depth chart and you look at Cook and Murray, they're going to get the majority of the carries, but he also can be a great kick returner as well, which is something the Vikings still lack on their roster. So bringing him in and having him be primarily a kick returner in year one, and then taking maybe over Murray's role in 2019 would be an ideal change of the guards. Otherwise, if you look a little later, Kalen Ballage is another running back at Arizona State who really blew up the combine. I mean, he's a physical freak, but it didn't really translate to his film at Arizona State. He could be someone they bring in almost in a Jerick McKinnon-like role where they kind of bring him along and see what he has in the tank and see if they can translate his game to the NFL a little better than what it showed in college.
One of the things you mentioned, Jeff, was all the picks we've got. I mean, we've got 8 picks here in this draft, and I'll tell you, it's a pretty loaded roster. I'm not sure there's enough place for 8 picks. Based on that, if you were the GM, if you were Rick Spielman here, would you in fact package some of those picks up and get fewer, more quality picks, or do you see a place for these folks both on the roster and practice squad?
You know what? You always want to take as many shots in those later rounds as possible. I mean, once you get past that third, fourth round, it is a lottery game at some point. GMs and front office personnel will tell you that you do your best to scout these players, but at that point, there's a flaw in everyone, and there's a reason why they weren't the top round pick or a priority player for most teams. And it's throwing darts at a board. It's really what it comes down to. So, I mean, you want to keep those picks, and you want to build as much depth on the roster as well. You never know when injuries are going to strike. But, yeah, part of it is filling out that practice squad. You want to have the most talented 53-man on your roster, and you want to have the most talented practice squad in the league. That's the goal.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, the odd twist is less about the draft and more about a position, and that's where we look at the quarterback situation here. And we said goodbye to 3 former starting quarterbacks in March, but we landed the big free agent prize that was out there in Kirk Cousins. And I know you've studied him. You've studied the other quarterbacks as well. Tell the fans what Cousins brings to the table that maybe the other 3 starters from a year ago didn't, and why is he an upgrade for this offense?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Cousins really culminates what the 3 quarterbacks each individually had into one body. I think that's probably the best way to look at it. He doesn't have the arm Sam Bradford did, but he's a lot more savvy in the pocket than Case Keenum was as well. And he does have the ability to throw the ball all over the field. I mean, really, when you look at it, he's an accurate passer who can make all the throws. And given the weapons he'll have in the Vikings offense, he should be able to make an impact immediately. The shortfalls in his game is his pocket presence, and that's where I think the Vikings really will look to invest heavily in the offensive line through the draft. you don't pay someone that kind of money not to protect them or give them all the resources possible to go out and play football at the highest level possible. But overall, I mean, now that the kind of shimmer's worn off of Kirk Cousins, now that we're about, almost a month and a half, 2 months away from when he signed with the Vikings, I think most people will tell you it was the right move. Free agent quarterbacks like him don't hit the market often. And the reason the Redskins let him hit the free agent market wasn't because there was some flaw in his game or there was some ongoing injury that they were worried about. He hit the market as a unrestricted free agent quarterback who's thrown for, nearly 4,000 yards a season. And some of that will translate to the Vikings offense. They're a more balanced team. But when put together with John DeFilippo, I think they'll come up with a pretty unique passing threat.
Mention, pocket presence. What's he lack? So in other words, obviously we saw Case Keenum he would scramble out of the pocket and he would make plays or at least give guys a chance to get open. What's the difference for Cousins?
Cousins likes to stay in the pocket if possible. You can get him moving on rollouts and whatnot, and he'll be accurate in those throws. But really, Cousins sometimes tries to do too much is the problem, and it's not playing hero ball necessary, but sometimes he doesn't fully understand when to give a play up. And what that ends up happening is he ends up getting surrounded in the pocket. Instead of just taking a sack, he'll either throw the ball up into traffic or he'll get strip sacked. And, I think an area of improvement for him especially will be protecting the ball. And, it's something that the Zimmer and the coaching staff has harped time and time again ever since they've been hired, is that they want to protect the football. And I think that's something they'll really work on with him and somewhere we'll see improvement this season. But, ultimately the offensive line will have to improve because we saw what happened in 2016 when Sam Bradford just stood behind the offensive line without much movement.
Behind Kirk Cousins, there's two former Bronco quarterbacks. One we really never got a chance to see last year, highly touted Kyle Sloter, who was on the roster, obviously. And then the Broncos starter from 2017, Trevor Siemian, came along when they got Case Keenum this year. What can you tell, either based on research or watching them play, what can you tell the fans about these two quarterbacks? Because let's face it, very few quarterbacks make it the entire season without somebody having to sub for them.
Yeah, well, don't get started on that quite yet. We have a few months before the season starts, and we have to start worrying about that. But I can cover both of them here briefly. Trevor Siemian, I thought, was a very good pickup for the Vikings. I think they did a bit of an agent favor by acquiring him and putting him in the same quarterback room as Kirk Cousins. But if you look at Trevor Siemian as a whole, he never set the world on fire in Denver, but I would say arguably he got the short end of the stick as well, being caught in the middle between them wanting to develop Paxton Lynch and then ultimately seeing, he wasn't the answer immediately last season. And we'll give Brock Osweiler a try because he was successful in his past tenure here. I think there's a lot of similarities between Siemian and almost what Case Keenum brought to the table last year. He understands the game at a very high level. He'll have a full understanding of the offense if he does need to come into the game. And he's not going to make many mistakes. People will say that he threw a number of interceptions in Denver, but given the weapons he'd have in Minnesota, if he really takes what's given to him, I think he'd be successful if he had to come into the game. When it comes to Kyle Sloter, if people don't know his story, he got the raw end of a stick in college and never was really able to prove himself. The thing that I saw when he played in the preseason last year is that he's a very anticipatory thrower. He can anticipate well and put the ball in windows before they're actually there. And I think with the arm strength that he brings to the table, those two traits combined are really what had teams excited about him. So I think we'll see how he progresses this offseason. But, I think the Vikings clearly carry three quarterbacks if he proves to even be half of what people perceive he is within the Vikings organization.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a passing league, so you wouldn't be surprised at all to see wide receiver come out, even though we saw the emergence of Stephon Diggs clearly in the Minneapolis Miracle and also Pro Bowler Adam Thielen last year. But, we've talked about this before, Jeff. Talk to fans about Laquan Treadwell. He's not really made the splash as a pass receiver. I know he's a good blocker downfield. Is he in the plans with, the changes the Vikings have seen at receiver and the emergence of the other two? And would you expect the Vikings to look for a receiver anywhere, before the fifth round in this draft?
On Treadwell, I would say the Vikings have definitely given him every opportunity to perform on the field. If you look at him last year, he's the number 3 wide receiver and isolated on the outside how many times? And he still couldn't make plays on the ball or gain the separation necessary to get Case Keenum to really trust him on a regular basis. if you watch the film and you look away from the ball and see what he's doing, he does get open from time to time. And I just don't think the trust was really there. There just wasn't much of a chemistry built between him and Case. And that's not necessarily all Treadwell's fault. But I think being able to prove yourself and being able to prove to be a worthy target comes through in time. I mean, throughout practices, throughout the games. I mean, at some point you're going to have to be called upon, and he just never really, I guess, was up to the task of this past season. I think Zimmer said it about right earlier this offseason. At this point, everything Treadwell gets is going to have to be earned. And I don't think the Vikings are going to put all of their eggs in that basket necessarily either. So when it comes to drafting a wide receiver, I do think they would be interested in a wide receiver. Kind of when we go back and we talked about Nyheim Hines, if they found the right wide receiver who could also be a kick returner and a punt returner and had that second use on the roster, I do think they would look wide receiver earlier in the draft just because they wouldn't need him to perform right away, but could easily carry them on the roster since they're performing some other important task.
On this roster last year, although practice squad most of the weeks, is Stacy Coley. Is Stacy Coley a play here? Does he have the upside to move up in this roster? Maybe take over Jarius Wright's slot position?
You know, I think him and Kendall Wright are going to have a nice competition in training camp. They both can perform in that slot role, but I think Coley also can be an outside receiver if you really needed him to be. I think last offseason and last preseason, Coley showed on multiple instances, but he's able to get open. And when he gets open, he can make plays with the ball in his hands. So obviously there's going to have to be some continuation of that, and the Vikings are going to look for him to take the next step. But the other player to really watch as we kind of head deeper into the offseason and early in the next season is Caleb Jones. I thought he was a player that showed well during the preseason last year and was on the cusp of making the roster. I think he could have a spot on this roster if he can take just a slight step in the right direction.
Yeah, I didn't know if anybody else was playing in that final preseason game except him.
Yeah, I mean, at times he can put on a show. He's a big target and he can get open. I mean, that's all you can really ask for. It's just a matter of showing it against some better competition.
Sure. Let me ask you the last two positions. You can lump them together or take them separately. Corners and defensive linemen. You always need both. Are there people in here that you see in this draft? You know, especially probably at the defensive end. You always need a pass rushing defensive end to spot somebody. Or at the cornerback position, given that Terrence Newman is not back yet, we don't know if he's going to continue on with the team. Are there people you'd look at in this draft?
Yeah, I'll take them separately. So I think until you really know for sure that Terrence Newman's going to be back, a cornerback is going to be a need in this draft class. I mean, the Vikings have their two outside cornerbacks, Xavier Rhodes and Trey Waynes, and a lot of teams would salivate over having those two guys on the outside. Mackenzie Alexander, I thought he played better in the slot than a lot of people give him credit for. It's kind of it's a position that you don't get much thank for. And when you look at the cornerbacks the Vikings have on the outside and Harrison Smith over top, the slot cornerback honestly is going to be the guy you pick on. It's just a matter of someone's always your weakest link, no matter of how strong the caliber of players you have around them. But as you look at the cornerback class, I mean, even as early as 30, if the right guy fell to them, Zimmer has shown that he's willing to develop cornerbacks and take them early in drafts, just because you can never have too many defensive backs. I think Isaiah Oliver is a guy I've kind of kept my eyes on. He's physical, and he has that length that you really like on the outside. But he also showed at times that he has the ball skills and the ability to get his head around too, which is something you really look for in those big corners. But if they start looking more for slot cornerbacks, Duke Dawson out of Florida is more of a second or third round pick that I think they'll keep their eye on. He's not the physical freak that the Vikings typically have found at defensive back, but he's very savvy and has good instincts at the position and knows how to play receivers and understand the routes that they're running before they're run. And he's kind of maybe more of the IQ guy that Zimmer sees as being able to kind of man the slot from a mental standpoint. When you look at the defensive line now, I think that the Vikings want to add both another interior pass rusher, although they added Sheldon Richardson already, and then maybe that hybrid outside linebacker defensive end combo who can get a pass rush from time to time. If you look at the defensive tackle position, I think it's similar to cornerback. They really could go as early as the first round if the right guy falls. If Taven Bryan, the quick twitch guy out of Florida, fell, I mean, I think he would be a great fit as a 4-3 under tackle. Obviously, he'd play behind Sheldon Richardson in year one, but the potential for him is really through the roof if he could develop any sort of real instincts to his game. Otherwise, Maurice Hurst out of Michigan's another player who's fallen down the board a little bit after suffering a heart issue at the combine, or it came up in his medicals at least. So far, from what I've heard, as many teams have cleared him on their board, and he's completely fine. The combine didn't bring him back for a medical recheck. And I think the thing that's really given some teams assurance is his dad, who played in the NFL, also had the same congenital heart defect and played 7 years without an issue. So they don't see that as being an issue. But in the mid-rounds, an interior lineman, Andrew Brown out of Virginia, he was a 5-star recruit coming into Virginia and never really put it all together. I think he's someone that the Vikings could see the physical skill sets there, and maybe he just needs some refinement and can become a good depth piece along that defensive line.
And now we get to go to opinion question here. So Zimmer, a quarterback in college, how much do you believe that he's involved in decisions on offensive playmakers? And what takes a guy who's an offensive mind and makes him so defensive-minded like Zimmer?
You know what? I think it always has to do with he thinks about it from the other side. If I'm the quarterback, how's the defense going to try to stop me? And maybe the conceptual knowledge is there. It's like, hey, I figured out how they're going to stop me. Well, and then one day you sit back and he's like, heck, I know how to stop a quarterback. I might as well be a defensive coordinator and figure out how I'm going to stop any quarterback.
Well, that's a good point. Now, I will have to follow up and ask this because all fans want to know this. You saw the NFC Championship game. It wasn't fun to watch after the first drive. What happened to that team? I looked at it, and I was obviously there live. It seemed like it was a tired Viking team. The emotional win probably took it out of them. What'd you see? What went wrong?
Tom, I thought we were over this. I thought we were never going to talk about that game again. But now that we're on the topic, I mean, I think the emotional win. It was such a high at the Minneapolis Miracle, winning that game, getting somewhere you didn't think that they would be. I mean, and I think almost scoring the touchdown early in that game, Kyle Rudolph scored right away to put the Vikings up 7-0, kind of let them take a deep breath and exhale almost too much to say, all right, we're back on our game, when really they weren't. And once Case Keenum kind of threw that pick six, things really started to unravel. Obviously, you have to give props to Philadelphia. It's a tough place to play. I mean, people will say fans are rowdy and whatnot, but as a player on the field, it's a different environment as a whole. NFC Championship game, rowdy fans, night game, the whole gamut. You're not expecting a situation where you're going to be given any favors. And the thing is, the Vikings let the game get away from them fast. Obviously, there was the defensive lapses, and I thought John DeFilippo actually and Frank Reich put together a really good offensive game plan against the Vikings defense, who wanted to sit underneath routes on Nick Foles, because if you looked at what Nick Foles had done in the playoffs so far and through the end of last season, they were just kind of keeping the offense very horizontal. They were taking what was given to him, and what they did is they ran their wide receivers and tight ends behind the Vikings defensive backs like they were running a horizontal route, and that double move was always down the field, and they were able to take advantage of that because the Vikings pass rushers couldn't get the Foles.
You know, that brings us to the end of our draft preview, but we encourage you to join us starting next Thursday, April 26th, on Twitter, @VikFans, where, Jeff, you're going to take over Twitter for those couple of days, talk to people about, your projections about who the Vikings are about to pick, and then you're going to give immediate reaction following those picks on where they fit or where they have some weaknesses for that Viking lineup. So that should be fun.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. I hope you can get some people can throw some questions my way that can stump me.
Sounds good. No problem. I've never been able to, but maybe they can. So until next week, for Jeff Nichols, I'm Tom Moore. Enjoy the draft, everyone.